and a very warm welcome to this month's PaceCast. I'm Anita Pace. Thank you for joining us. My guest today is a leading figure in a company that has its roots firmly established here in Hull. The company dates back to 1840 and now employs more than 40,000 people around the world. It manufactures many household brands that we'll all be very familiar with in our homes. The company is, of course, Reckitt, and my guest today is the Chief Medical Officer, Bruce Charlesworth. Hello and welcome, Bruce.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. And thank you for coming out on what is a very windy Friday.
Very windy.
Very windy. So those of you who are new to our PaceCast might not know that we ask our guests to bring in an object that's memorable or important to them. So I don't know what Bruce has brought in, but I'm looking forward to hearing what it is and why it's important to him. So over to you.
Okay, so it's actually two items, which is a bit of a combo. So one is a stethoscope. And one is an epidural. So those who might know what that is, I guess that'll mean different things to different people. So what that signifies, so I was an anaesthetist when I qualified originally. So I did medicine. I wanted to be an anaesthetist. And it really speaks to why I've ended up doing what I'm doing, because of the frustration with devices. That's where it began. So what I found was that I was using things in a hospital setting, such as this, and thinking, why is that made like that? Why don't they think about this, that, and the other? And I got talking to the representatives and the manufacturers that make them, and got really interested in product development and the insights that go behind them. So that's what led me then into a career in pharmaceuticals and devices, and ending up doing what I do today, which is to design the products of the future. Yeah.
Thank you. Fascinating. Right. So let's go right back to the beginning then. Bruce is a little boy. So we'll start from the beginning.
Yep.
Your childhood. Any major influences as you were growing up?
Yeah. So I was born and bred in West Yorkshire before I kind of came over this side. So I'm a
good side.
Yeah. So I was born and brought up in Wakefield. I guess my dad was a big influence. My dad was a policeman from being a very young age, left school at a young age, and had done very well in the police, and sort of ended up being chief constable, and had done very well in his career, and always drove into us that it was about what you'd done, how you did it, how you communicated, your leadership, and anybody can do anything. So I think that ethos always in me and my brother, so I've got an older brother, was what we were brought up with. So he came from a very big family, and lots of different siblings, that had really stood out as someone who was determined. So I think that determination came from my dad. My mum is just a very kind individual, generally sort of just really nice and kind. So I've always had this ethos about work hard and be nice to people. That's my kind of combo platter.
A good combination that's served you well.
I think so.
So school, was it easy? Did you enjoy school?
I did enjoy school, although I was always a bit of what I would describe as a bit of an entrepreneur in doing things. I was always the guy selling the school magazine, trying to think about buying products from Macro and how can I retail them and make a bit of money. I was always a bit sort of entrepreneurial, I think.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Because you went into medicine.
Yeah, and it was combined with science. And I guess that's why, again, I've ended up doing what I do in business and science rather than maybe pure science.
Right.
I was always a frustrated business person, I think. Didn't really know what it meant, but I clearly kind of had that acumen. So I was probably a bit of a character at school, known for being maybe a little bit disruptive at times and a bit sort of maverick, but sort of knuckled down, as you say, did medicine afterwards. So I studied the sciences through school, which I found really interesting. I was always, as a little kid, according to my mum, turning stones over and finding bugs and looking at trees and plants and things. I was always interested in science and nature, I think.
And you studied that at uni, did you, when you went to? Yeah,
so I went to Leeds University. When we'd already moved actually over to this area. So when I was a teenager, I lived in the Brough area. So my first job, I had two jobs. My first was in a petrol station at St Andrew's Quay, which is still there. So that still makes me chuckle when I go in there. And I worked at Smith Nephew as well as a transporter, so on the shop floor, just in holidays and weekends.
Right, okay.
So that was my first, I guess, foray into medical devices and that sort of arena. So it still makes me, again, laugh today when I speak to the colleagues and people I know at Smith Nephew. And I used to work there on the shop floor, moving things.
So you graduated, you went to Leeds Uni, you graduated. Mm-hmm. What happened after that?
So I really wanted to kind of specialize in anesthetics. That was what I was always interested in. Not sure why. I think it was the device. It was doing things with your hands and being involved with kind of, intensive care and all that side of things really interested me. So I did my house jobs in Leeds. So I was at Jimmy's and at LGI. And then I moved away. I went down to Essex actually to do a rotation. So you typically apply for a rotation for 2 or 3 years doing a speciality. And I went down to Essex. I was slightly following my heart, following someone I had met.
Okay.
So at that time. And so I went down to Chelmsford, and I did my anaesthetics training down there in Broomfield in near Chelmsford. So yeah, that was, I really enjoyed that. And then really started thinking about what does this career potentially look like, as I showed you the devices. I was handling things like epidurals and devices and equipment. And it just didn't ever feel kind of really optimally designed, frankly. It was sort of, who designs this? Why do you do that? And I got really inquisitive about product design. And that's where the two sort of combined for the future career.
So at what point did you stop practicing medicine then and move into business?
It's an interesting phrase. My answer to that is always the same, which is I didn't stop practicing medicine.
Yeah. I realised as soon as I said that.
I still argue that I practice medicine, but on a kind of population basis. So it's an interesting question. I left the NHS after I'd locumed for a while, so I knew what I wanted to do, and I wanted to join industry. It's actually not a natural transition. It's quite unlike something like law, where you might end up in business naturally. Going from actually practicing medicine to being in industry is not an easy step. So I think it's a bit easier today with a bit more transparency. But it was sort of seen as you say, like giving up, and doing something else.
But not only that, I mean, it's a different skill set altogether.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I think really all you bring is your medical knowledge. And that's what I knew I could bring. And I'd learned some of those leadership behaviours, but I didn't know anything about business and meetings and things like that. So that was a new world.
You had people skills, though, which is a big element, isn't it?
I'd like to think I did. Yeah. And I think so. Started looking at different, and I really didn't know what I was looking for. So I spoke to some reps and people in industry who I had met, over the years when I was practicing. I decided to locum for a year, so I sort of was self-employed. So I could, between interviews, I could still do bits of work, which I really enjoyed. And then I ended up going to AstraZeneca. So I joined AstraZeneca in 2000. And that was as what was then called a commercial medical advisor. So I was basically working on pain products and headache products and a bit of anaesthetics. So it was a natural fit. And that was when this world of meetings and meeting rooms and calendars and
PowerPoint
Outlook
presentations.
and it's just something I'd never done, but I found it really interesting. It was really insightful, and the rest is history, really.
And were you on the product development side then? Is that what your role entailed?
Yeah, it was. At that time, I was research and development. Yeah. So it was a really interesting portfolio in headache and migraine, actually, that I was working on. So there was some very early products that were sort of in very early testing, so not even made it to market. And then there were some that were launched. So I got a really nice exposure to the whole product life cycle. That was where I kind of cut my teeth in terms of the job. And then since then I've done everything from right the way through, from developed products, different products, devices, medicines. But yeah, started out in pharma, very focused on development.
So after AstraZeneca, so how long were you at AstraZeneca for?
First time around, because I did go back there. I was there for about 4 years.
Right.
So that was my first kind of ended up being what was then a global product team physician, so kind of the senior medic on the role. And I was in a global research and development role. And what I really wanted to do was get even closer to the commercial end. So I moved to Pfizer at that point, and then I was in the UK marketing organisation. So the way it works is it's typically a global team and then a local team. And on this one, I was working for Pfizer UK. So I moved down to Surrey and was down there for a couple of years doing the local medical affairs and on the launch products. Yeah.
And then after there you went back to AstraZeneca?
I did, yeah. So I got headhunted back to AstraZeneca. And I wasn't back there long because I think it was the classic thing of, never go back. They say that in relationships and everything. So that was one of my bits of advice. And I did it. I mean, I did it for all the right reasons. I thought, right, well, I'll go back and I'll use the influence I've learned at Pfizer in AstraZeneca, but it just wasn't meant to be. So I wasn't back there long before I then moved on.
Where was next in your journey?
So that was this is a bit of a learning for me. So I'm a big believer in fate and just kind of what happens. Mm-hmm. So I was sat, as I was leaving AstraZeneca, in a bar in Manchester, having some lunch, a sushi bar actually. And a guy, just got talking to a guy, and he said, I'm an investor in private equity, and I've just invested in a little diagnostics business. So I said, all right, interesting. What do you do? And they said, I'm looking for a chief executive. So I said, oh, you might have found him. So we literally, from that moment on, I just said, well, can I come and have an interview? So I went to Chester the next day and ended up getting this job. So I ended up moving into a little tiny private equity-backed diagnostics business for a while.
Based in Manchester?
It was based over in Chester.
Right.
Yeah. So did that for a little while. That was very much an equity, sort of high-risk thing. It was just while I figured out what to do next. But it was a great experience. Lots of experience of private equity and presenting, but sort of
very different to what you'd
very different
done before.
But that was again, I think that really sparked my interest again in the commercial side and the business acumen and the finance interest and what have you.
It's very heavily weighted towards finance, isn't it? Private equity. So there's no escaping the numbers.
Yeah, exactly. So that was fascinating for a while, and it was a bit like Dragon's Den. So we're down in the city looking for investors, pitching the product and things like that.
So what prompted your next move then?
So the next move was a really interesting one. So I knew that working in probably a very small private equity at that point in my life was probably a little bit too high risk with a young family and bits and pieces. So I was looking for something a bit more steady. And I was reading a job section in a newspaper, and it was a job, it was anonymous actually, it didn't say what it was, but it said it was a job in a highly regulated industry, and they were looking for someone to transition into what was kind of described as a fun company doing this fun job. So I applied for it. And it turned out to be in a beer company. So it was with Molson Coors, working on Carling and things like that. So completely different. So if you think moving from medicine into the industry is different, that was even more different. But I pursued it, and I thought, this is really interesting. And actually I get some very different commercial experience, even more leadership in a different industry.
And were you running this part of the business? Or
no, it was, so the job was working on some merger and acquisition stuff, and it was working on strategy. So at that point, the beer industry's gone through an enormous change over the last few years, as you'll know, from sort of pubs and, drinking pubs to food and all those different combos and the heritage of beer and provenance and all that.
And craft beers.
And craft beers, exactly. Yeah. That whole revolution was sort of happening at that point. So they were looking to bring people in from other industries to rethink the model. So I worked in the strategy team. So we did a few merger and acquisitions, worked on Cobra, that moved into Molson Coors and a few other brands. So it's really, really interesting, but very, very different.
Very different.
And funnily enough, I did meet a few of the scientists. So my boss was a biochemist, because biochemists often, well, not often, but a lot of brewers are biochemists because it's a biochemical process. And the guy who ran the little craft brewery on site was actually a medic. Which was strange. There was actually a group of medics and scientists who'd all gone into beer. So it must be a common interest. Yeah. Who knew?
Medicine drives you all to beer.
Exactly.
Okay, so what came next?
So I did that for a few years. And then going back to my fate thing, I was actually traveling with the job at Molson, and I was in an airport one day, and I bumped into an ex-colleague from AstraZeneca. And she said, I'm working in an agency world now. I do health outcomes. I'm working in this little business over in Cheshire again, going back. I seem to have these connections with these places I seem to go back to. And she said, we're looking for a managing director, actually, for the UK business. So I said, I might be interested in that. So it was another one of those where just absolute serendipity, rang her up and said, look, put my CV in front of the chief exec and see what he thinks. Had an interview, and they made me an offer. So I went and did that. And so I joined a company which was then called Mappy Values, which we then transformed into Adelfi, which was part of the Adelfi group, part of Omnicom. And I worked there for just over 4 years, between there and Boston in the US. So I ran the Boston office as well. And that was, again, a very different thing. So working agency side in health. So it was very much an industry I knew, but working on the sort of the agency side rather than the client side.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
There you go.
This is fascinating. So where after that then?
And after that was Reckitt. So that's Reckitt. When I ended up where I am today. Right. Yeah. So it was, I think this is the biggest learning I've had in my career. It sounds very deliberate, like I built those building blocks. Yeah. And I always say this when I'm coaching and mentoring people at work is try not to be too structured with it, because these opportunities come along. So arguably I have had all the necessary experience to kind of do what I do today from different perspectives. But it's been as much by chance as it has been by design. And
listening to your story there, it sounds like you have a tendency perhaps to have itchy feet after a little while, because you're always but when an opportunity comes your way, you're very open to it. But am I right in thinking you've been at Reckitt now 10 years?
10 years, yeah.
So that's quite a record for you.
Yeah, it is.
By the sounds of it.
It is. And I think that's driven by the dynamic nature of Reckitt. Right. I mean, talking about Reckitt, there's been a lot of change over the years, and just the interesting nature of the job and the passion I have for it. I think that's what it is. I think, I always say people leave jobs for two reasons. There's pushes and pulls. So there's usually a reason why someone's thinking of leaving, and then there's a real pull. And at no point have those two married up while I've been at Reckitt. So I've always had something interesting. We have a real thing about developing people and allowing them to be the best selves, and there's very much an autonomy to Reckitt, even though it's a big company, which I enjoy. So there's kind of the ability to do what you do best and really have an impact. So I think I've always found that. We've been through different chief executives, different directions of travel, going through another one at the moment, which we've just publicly announced. So there's always something to remain interested. I think it's a fantastic company in terms of heritage. The brands are obviously amazing. And what I do, I really enjoy. So it's a combination of everything I learned in a perfect job, really, for them.
So you mentioned there what you do. What does a chief medical officer at a company like Reckitt do? What's a typical day look like?
So I actually wear two hats. So I lead Hull in terms of the campus alongside other colleagues. So where we show up as Reckitt with the council or on things like this, when we're talking about the media or whatever it might be for Reckitt, I tend to lead on that. So that's one part of my job. The chief medical officer bit, which is the main job that I have, is essentially looking after all of the evidence that we have within the company around our products. So it's, if you take something like Gaviscon, it sounds very simple to sell that and advertise it on TV, but everything obviously needs to be underpinned by evidence. So when we make the claims we make, when we have the packaging we've got, the instructions we've got, all of the clinical work that we do, the studies, the trials, that's what my team and I do. So it might be designing new evidence for competitive advantage. It might be working with the safety teams on we need to demonstrate safety in certain populations. And that goes across all of our products. So I tend to touch anything where health is an outcome. So obviously that covers all of our hygiene portfolio, some of the nutrition, certainly all of our self-care brands. So Nurofen, Mucinex, cough, cold things, Strepsils, all of that sort of portfolio. And then when we talk about Dettol, clearly there's some germs and bugs and diseases in there that we think about. So it's really the evidence base for our products. And then if there's ever a big burning issue, like with COVID and Dettol, obviously I then lead with the company in terms of what that means for us as an opportunity.
I was going to ask actually about COVID. So what did that mean for Reckitt at the time?
It was huge. I mean, big change, both from a site perspective and how we continued to run the business, because we were classed as a critical, business for that point of view. Our portfolio also hugely shifted. So you see a real impact of human behavioural changes on our portfolio. So for example, people really weren't getting coughs and colds because they were staying at home. So that spread of every infection did massively decrease. So sales of things like Strepsils and Nurofen and Mucinex really dropped off. But actually, obviously, things like Dettol and hygiene and wipes and hand sanitizers massively grew. So we had to rethink our manufacturing, our evidence base. We had to do tests on the products, against SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID. So all of that became a very interesting, dynamic. And then how do we keep our products on the shelf? And it was a really interesting measure of human behavior. And we see that reflection in our products, which are quite seasonal anyway, but it really changed that.
And
dynamic.
has it gone back to pre-COVID type?
Great question. Yeah, there was a little bit of a dip. It pretty much has, yeah. And Dettol and some of the hygiene brands are slightly above that because they would naturally grow year on year anyway. There was obviously a sharp drop off after COVID when behaviour shifted. But I think we played a real role in one bit, which was what we called the infodemics. There was a lot of really bad information during COVID about, what you could and couldn't take, what you should do. And we tried to cut through that without being sort of too self-serving by demonstrating that which active ingredients did work best effectively, what method of hygiene was the best to do. So again, my teams and I worked on that. So we were big proponents of targeted hygiene rather than spraying everything down and spraying everything. We said, look, if you take this approach, actually it will work really effectively and efficiently. And some of those behaviours have stuck. So we believe we kind of educated people through COVID as well.
Yeah. While you're talking then, a thought just occurred to me about, how many brands are there in Reckitt? Do you know?
Oh, great question. I get caught out lots.
Yeah.
We have a list of what we call our kind of power brands, or our core brands, which are essentially across, health and then household. Right, yeah. But we've mentioned it through. So, Nurofen, Strepsils, Gaviscon, to name a few of the main ones in Hull. We've got, and then Vanish on the sort of household side, Dettol, Harpic. There's.
Well, the question was going to be, which you might not know this, which is the best-selling brand at Reckitt across all the categories?
It depends how you look at it in terms of geographies. So our biggest brands, so one is Mucinex, which most people in the UK won't have even heard of, which is an interesting dynamic in our business. A lot of effort in research and development goes into market-specific products. So Mucinex is a huge one. That's one of the biggest over-the-counter selling medicines in the world, and that's a cough and cold brand in the US. So if you live in the US, you see that all over the TV. That's what everyone takes for their coughs and colds. So that's a huge one in self-care, our biggest.
Right.
And then Dettol clearly is a huge global brand from a hygiene point of view. Yeah. And then you've got things like Finish and Vanish. They're some of our biggest brands around the world, which are global. Do
you know the biggest in the UK? I'm just interested. That's all.
It's a great question. I can't answer that. Guess? I think Nurofen from a self-care point of view is probably our biggest.
Yeah. I know it well, especially on a Saturday morning after a Friday night. Yeah. Anyway, let's move on. So you've clearly travelled around quite a bit as well. Mm-hmm. Did you move to East Yorkshire as a result? Oh, move back home actually.
Yeah, felt like coming back home.
Yeah. As a result of the Reckitt role.
Yes, I did. So again, I think that was part of the opportunity. Right. So when I got approached for it, I wasn't really looking to move from the agency. It was a headhunt, sort of, we really think you could do this job. And originally it's in Slough, and I kind of went, I don't really want to be in Slough. And then someone had mentioned, we have a thing in Hull. So because I'd lived here.
Have a thing in Hull. Reckitt was born in Hull.
Exactly. But it was very much, I didn't, and it's really interesting you mentioned that, Anita, because one of the big passions I have, and one of the reasons I do a lot of what I do, is I don't want anyone else to leave this region and not know that Reckitt exists. Yeah. So I lived here for several years. I worked at Smith Nephew. I've been in and out of Hull. I'd never heard of Reckitt. Never heard of. Most people who were born in Hull had, but then it was Reckitt Benke's. But I didn't know
Reckitt and Coleman.
existed.
I remember Reckitt and Coleman. Yeah.
So the name is there, but so I've made a real commitment to the business to say we won't let that happen, which is why we do a lot of stuff with schools, the community, the sponsorships we've started doing more recently. To really make sure that the name is out there, because to your point, I didn't know, and when they said, I've got this thing in Hull, I was like, right, that's quite interesting. So that's how I ended up coming back, because it was the Hull connection, and I thought, well, it's a nice area, I know where I can live. So I started looking at houses around the villages, and I was pleasantly
surprised how cheep they are compared with the south of England. Yeah, exactly. So culturally, it must have been a big. I mean, you talked about some of your previous roles, and when I think about the startup, the private equity backed one. Culturally, you've experienced very different organisations. Reckitt is a huge global company. So how did you find the shift from going, say, from a small entrepreneurial, very agile, I suspect, quick decisions, fail fast, that sort of mentality, to, and having worked with Reckitt, I hope you don't mind me saying this, a very slow, in terms of decision-making organisation, very bureaucratic to some degree. How do you find that?
It's fascinating, actually, because I think I've probably living now a bit of a combo plateau world of everything I've experienced. So I would say that big pharma is probably the slowest and bureaucratic for the right reasons, because it's very governed, it's very scientific, regulated, right? Yeah. So AstraZeneca, Pfizer, again, not critical of them. There's a lot of process, there's a lot of doing the right thing, and things are very slow and long-winded development. As you say, the private equity-backed diagnostic and the agency to some degree was all about autonomy and speed. And you'll know in an agency world, you're a bit hand to mouth, exactly, pace and hand to mouth. It's sell on, deliver it. What should we do next? That business development mentality was there, and the autonomy, because I was the president of the business. So I think the hardest thing was going from that back into corporate, where actually I wasn't autonomous. I couldn't just do things. So there was an element of that. But like I said earlier about Reckitt, I do think for a large organisation, Reckitt has an incredible amount of can-do and actually isn't particularly process-driven, where we don't need it. You can just make your own decisions, and we have this sort of thing around freedom to succeed is one of the strap lines we use for our recruitment, and it is genuinely true. So for a big company, it often feels like a small company. We often get referred to as the biggest small company, because it's very large, but it does feel quite small, and you can get on and do things. So I occasionally I do think there's the frustration of a big company, but I think we're pretty good at dealing with it and getting on with things and making decisions and choices.
And what's the favourite? The thing you enjoy doing most in your current role, would you say?
I think designing and interpreting evidence from a clinical standpoint. So I think when you can think about clinical studies as a necessary thing to do, as when you're developing a product, oh, we've got to do this. Whereas I like to put insight and thinking into that, say, well, what competitive advantage could we deliver? So for me, it's the combination of commercial acumen and differentiation and benefit to consumers combined with the science we can do. So, what's a new indication? What's a new thought we could have on that product that would benefit a consumer and deliver value to Reckitt and is quite insightful? So I really enjoy the innovation side of what I do. It's not, for me, the medical part and the chief medical officer is not there just to govern and keep people safe. It's a big part of what I do, and it has to be right, but it's also about being creative. So it's the creativity side of it.
And it sounds like you've still, as one of the leaders in the organisation, you've still got, you're still working on the tools, so to speak. You're still involved in the doing.
I think that is one of the, again, that's a bit of a characteristic of Reckitt, and it's what's kept me interested. It's very much, there. This morning I've been in a meeting talking about org design and what we're doing and how we're doing it. And yesterday I was in the details of an approach we're taking on one of our cough products to get it launched, and how do we design a study, how many consumers, how many patients shall we put in there? So it is. And we rely on that depth of knowledge. And I think that's probably why I enjoy my job so much, because I'm not just stood back leading it and watching it. I really do try my best to get involved without micromanaging the team. Obviously, they've got their own capabilities. Yeah. But we've got a really highly skilled group of people, and we bring all of that knowledge to bear and work in a really sort of matrix manner. So,
you mentioned micromanaging. So if I was to ask one of your team members to describe you in terms of what sort of leader you are, what do you think they'd say?
I think they'd probably say servant leadership or alongside. Servant leadership, where it's kind of, I'm there to, I always say this, I work for them. And I always think that in a leader, I genuinely do. So I'm happy to have vision and drive and ideas and put that forward, but I'm certainly not kind of command and control. I think, and that probably comes from the way I've been treated over the years. I think where I've been most frustrated is when I'm maybe not listened to or my ideas can't come through. And just a lot of things I've learned through a lot of different jobs is, very often the people doing the work know the answer. You've just got to get it out of them. So I tend to facilitate and work with the team rather than saying I've got all the best ideas, I'm driving it. But I will make a decision when I need to. So I'm a big believer in the fact that leadership decisions are really important as well. Everything can't be consensus all of the time. And sometimes you've got to make brave choices and say, well, I'm going to take a risk on this. But most of the time I tend to ask the team. So, at the moment we're looking at org design and what we do and how we do it. I want to hear their thoughts. What do they think about it? How do we make that work together?
And in terms of challenges, anything that keeps you awake at night at the moment?
I think where industry is going in general from a regulation point of view, and I think how that might impact our ability to deliver the best thing for consumers. So, access to the right hygiene and self-care products is really important. And I think one of the things I've long found frustrating actually in our industry is sometimes the regulations are there for the right reasons and sometimes they can get in the way. So I think that how do we really show up in a responsible way to say, actually, we have the same interests as you, the regulator, or you, the safety people. We're not trying to do anything untoward. But I think as that's tightening up in terms of what you can put in where, the transparency of ingredients, sustainability, it is starting to potentially really have an impact and stifle innovation. So I think how we keep that moving at pace and how we keep that really delivering in the context of increased regulation and scrutiny, I think is one thing that I do think about a lot.
Yeah. Okay, so you touched on earlier the fact that Reckitt is an active. What's a good word to describe it? Very active in the community in East Yorkshire. And I know you represent Reckitt in many places. I hope you don't mind me saying so, but when I mentioned that I was interviewing you today, someone referred to you as the man with the shirts. And I can't help but notice you're wearing one of your infamous shirts today, which I think says a lot about your So how would you describe your personality?
I think I'm probably perceived as being maybe more extrovert than I am.
Yeah.
If I do,
really?
On some of the personality things, without going into my Myers-Briggs, exact personality, I am actually quite introverted. I don't mind spending time in all of that introversion comes through.
Right.
So I wouldn't say I'm kind of. I think a lot of the dress stuff comes from probably my clinical career, where as an anaesthetist and working in operating, this is part of my theory. You tend to wear scrubs all day, so everyone looks the same. So if you think about what surgeons try and do, they wear the bandanas and the colours. They introduce a bit of that. I think that's probably where that comes from. So it's a bit of kind of, well, I need some spice because all day I've been, you know, in a bland outfit. That's what I think. I think I always try and be authentic. I'm a big believer in true self, diversity of thought, behaviour, without ever doing anything that upsets anyone. I think people should be allowed to show their true character. So I hope I'm seen as authentic to the point. You know, I don't wear a shirt like this for anyone except me. I just do it because I like it, and that's the way it works. And there's a funny story about my shirts, actually. So the when I worked for the agency,
yes, you look more like you work in an agency.
Oh, there we go. So maybe I've kept that characteristic. Yeah. But the company that I buy a lot of my shirts from, actually this one as well, are actually based in the same building that the agency, and I didn't know this. So I used to buy shirts, and little did I know they were literally being delivered from downstairs. And I used to
I hope you didn't pay postage.
Well, I did, because they were putting them in the post. I didn't even know it was there. And then I found out one day, I was looking at the address and I thought, that's literally downstairs. And I'd left by that point. So I worked there the whole time. And genuinely bought shirts from a business downstairs.
That is bizarre.
Yeah, in the same building, which I never knew. So there we are.
I don't think I've ever seen you in what would be considered more of a traditional shirt.
No, I do have some. Special occasions can be, particularly somber ones, can be a problem if you're trying to, do something that's a bit sensible. But it's funny because if I do that, people then ask me what's the matter with me. So it does seem to be an ever kind of increasing scale of loudness, because if I ever if I have just put on polo shirt at work, everyone will say, are you okay? Yeah. So you kind of got to keep it.
Well, it's part of your personal brand now. It is, it's an expectation.
It is. Yeah, it is. I mean, I'm open. I'm not all about shirts, but it is one of the things that
I think it's good. I think it's good that you've got something that people associate with you, as long as it's not a negative thing. So 10 years on the door with Reckitt this month, I believe.
Yep.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
What does the future hold, do you think, for you? What excites you? Do you think there's another move around you probably can't say if there is, but do you think you're open to opportunities if the right thing was to come along?
I think right now in Reckitt, we're at such an interesting point of our growth and reinvention. That's been publicly shared in terms of where we are. And I was talking to my boss this morning about this. I think the expectation and the opportunity for leadership right now in Reckitt is bigger than it's ever been in terms of our direction of travel and our ambition. So there is definitely a few years left in me yet in defining that strategy, how we get through optimally this restructure that we're looking at, how we really drive the regions, how we really drive end-to-end research and development. So there's a huge opportunity in front of me for the coming years to do that. And that's really all I'm focused on. And whatever I can contribute to the business, and I can see the contribution I'm making, because that's hugely important to me, and I'm getting satisfaction out of it, I think that's, then the rest will come. So no, I'm not looking at other things. I've obviously, as you come to this point in your career, you think, would I one day have a portfolio career? Would I want to get involved in some other areas? Obviously I'm an active member on Future Humber and things like that. So how do I contribute more to those things potentially? But nothing's really kind of grabbed me yet and thought, I'll go and do that, because I'm very satisfied with what I'm doing day to day.
If you could change one thing about yourself, what do you think that would be?
That's a tough question. I think I would probably try and be less of a perfectionist with things. I think I've learned that over the years, but particularly when I was younger, I think I wasted a lot of time worrying about small things, the silly things like a scratch on my car, or if something wasn't quite right. From that perspective, I think I've learned to just live and let things go a little bit more. It would probably be that. So I could be a little bit more free and easy with what I do, and it doesn't have to be right all the time in every single detail.
Yeah, I wish I could be like that. I can't. Yeah. I've tried.
You can't be which, a perfectionist, or the other way?
No, I do sweat the small stuff. Right. I do overthink things. I do, I do want things to be perfect, and it's a lot of wasted energy sometimes, I think.
Yeah, it is. I think it comes naturally with the jobs we do, because the detail is really important. So sometimes you go, well, that's why everything I do is right. But then sometimes you kind of think it'd probably been all right if I hadn't done those extra bits. So
going back to the Myers-Briggs you touched on earlier, what sort of personality are you then? Can you remember what you came out with?
Yeah, so I when I've done it before, it's an INTP. So sometimes I border on the E, but I'd be INTP is kind of where I am. And I've done lots of these profiling things. So I tend to be very positive, and sometimes I get feedback from my team that I'm too positive. It's like, you never look at the negatives, because I am very glass half full, and I'm a people person. I'm just drive forward, we'll get it done, we'll work through it, and sometimes I think therefore I can ignore maybe some of the negatives. But I do like time on my own. I like time to reflect. I like a good walk. I like spending time with my dogs and just chilling out and go and do something on my own. So I'm not someone I'm not a very yellow, people, lots of energy from lots and lots of people. I can sometimes probably seem a bit in the background. I hope that never comes across as like aloof or arrogant, but sometimes I do just withdraw and kind of think I just want to be on my own for a bit and just have a think.
Yeah, well, it takes all sorts, doesn't it? And a good team is a blend of all these different personalities. And
we've just done an exercise actually with my lead team last week at one of the companies in Hull, and we did a full profiling, a print profiling of everybody, and that was one of the strengths that came through. We have a lot of very similar, but actually I mentioned it earlier, that diversity of thought I think is so important. And that's probably my biggest learning in industry over the years is asking people if they know the answer. I've had 2 experiences of that. So when I was at AstraZeneca, there was a meeting where a lady actually knew the answer but just didn't feel she could speak up. And it wasn't until we got about a year into this, she just one day said, "This isn't going to work." And I was like, why haven't you said anything? But no one had asked. So she'd kind of sat there quiet. Now I tend to in meetings, I go, does anybody know the answer to this question?
That's good advice, actually. On the subject of advice, what advice would you give to the young Bruce with the benefit of all your wisdom now?
I think I use a framework today that I often give to people when I'm coaching them, and I use it now, and I wish I'd used it probably more in my life earlier, which is when you're, I think, at your best and your happiest and everything's going right, is when you're doing something that you really love doing. It's something that you're good at, and it's something that someone needs you to do. It sounds really, really basic. So, you're good at it, you love doing it, and someone needs you to do it. And I wish I'd maybe use that framework consistently from a young age. And I use it now for doing tasks, for doing jobs, and I use it when I'm coaching. So I often say, if you can find that sweet spot, and I would challenge anyone to say that's probably, I bet that's when you are at your happiest. Is when you're doing something enjoyable that you're good at, that someone needs you to do. And I think really think through, if one of those is missing, what do you need to do to shift that? Bit of a heavy one, but I think that using that framework through my earlier career would have helped me.
That's good advice. Thank you. We'll share that. Well, thank you, Bruce. Congratulations on your career success.
Thank you.
It sounds like you've had a fascinating journey, and I'm pleased that you are planning to stay with us in this area for a lot longer.
Absolutely, yeah. I think I've got a lot more years in me left in me yet.
Good, so. And obviously Reckitt is a big part of this area's heritage, and I'm pleased that the company is continuing to invest in the area as well.
Absolutely,
which is brilliant.
Yeah. I mean, there's always been, for those that don't know, I mean, particularly James Reckitt and that the family back in the 1800s it was a Quaker ethos. So the number of things that Reckitt have built over the years is actually phenomenal when you look at it. So Ferrens Way, the road, Ferrens was the director of the site. We were the founders of the hospital, of the university. So I'm part of Ferrens, that name, that came from Reckitt, again from Ferrens. There's the Reckitt Art Gallery. There's an awful lot of stuff which, when you start piecing it together, you think, wow, they really did do a lot for the City Garden Village. So we're trying to keep doing that, and it's much harder when you're a publicly owned business, clearly, because I can't just say, well, we're just going to invest in that and I'm going to do all these things. But it's why we've done the things with the charities more recently, the Children's University. It's why we're one of the founding partners of the UTC. We've done the sponsorship of the Seahawks, the ice hockey, recently. So we're doing that again this season. We've just announced that sponsorship deal. So that, I think, is all about giving back, and it's a win-win because people get to hear the Reckitt name and not leave the region without remembering who we are, which is one of my big
where Reckitt came from.
Exactly.
And you've invested in the Innovation Centre as well, so it's
absolutely, physically and in terms of people. So we've grown significantly. We're at about 1,900 people now on site. When I joined, it was about 1,100, so we've invested a lot, and we've put about over 200 million pounds into that site or that campus in the last 5 years. So pretty significant.
Well, long may it continue. Yeah. Thank you again for coming in today. So before you go, I've got a question that was left by our previous guest. Now, he didn't know who he was leaving it for, but I have the question here. Okay. And the question is, what would you have done differently?
It's a fantastic question. I think the one thing I would have done differently is I would have travelled more internationally before I had family inside down out of because I've broadened my perspectives in terms of type of company. And the one thing I did was go and live in Boston, and I did a bit in Sweden with AstraZeneca, and I've worked in the US and Japan and other areas, but I never went and lived somewhere.
Did you not live in Boston then?
I lived there for a few months of the year, so I kind of did 6 months, and I was there every other week kind of thing. The one thing I've never done, which I'm always, envious might be too strong a word, but I always admire in people, and there's a lot of it at Reckitt, is people who've lived in different places. So people can say, when I was in the US for 2 years, then when I was in India for 2 years, then when I was in China. So I think that, because that would add another level of diversity of thought and cultural experience. And I'm hoping I'd get that through working with all of those teams. But it would be to have gone and physically located myself somewhere else, either alone or with my family at some point in my career. And I still still there as an option, but that's the one thing I would do differently.
Yeah, I think it's harder, isn't it, when you've got family and children? Yeah,
and I think if, depending on your lifestyle, a lot of my colleagues are very much, I can live in a flat and I haven't got a lot of things. I've unfortunately got hobbies, and I like animals, and I have a flock of sheep, and I have things that you can't just pick up and move. Exactly. So it's those ties, I think. So that's why I say prior to those, I would have probably done it. But I'm not sure my dogs and my cats and my animals would thank me now for putting them in the back of a lorry. So maybe one day. Yeah.
So thanks for sharing that with us, Bruce. And thank you again for coming in today.
Thank you.
So that's it for this month's PaceCast. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back again next month with our next guest. But until then, if you've got any questions or any suggestions about who you'd like to see us interview, please do let us know and contact us via our normal social media channels. But until then, it's bye-bye from me. Bye-bye.